Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers is a weekly program designed to answer all your questions, including the ones you didn't even know you had, and to clarify the endless debates around the wonderful and fascinating world of sexuality. Join us for real talk about sex from two experts in the field. Richard and Larry Siegel have over 50 years of experience as sex therapists, educators, counselors, and researchers. The Siegel Brothers are recognized around the world as trainers of medical and mental health professionals.
Hello, and welcome to Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers. I am Larry Siegel, a clinical sexologist and certified sexuality educator.
And I'm Ricky Siegel, a certified sex therapist and supervisor.
And proud to say, my brother, our weekly toast to you, my brother, and to you all.
You. Thank you for joining us for Sex Talk. Our special sake toast to you.
Yes, indeed. Yes,
as
indeed.
our tradition is. So, I love my job every day, but I really love my job today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Today we have the pleasure of talking about an incredibly important subject that does not get talked about nearly often enough.
No.
A wonderful, exquisite, glorious part of human anatomy known as the clitoris.
Indeed. Indeed. Plural would be clitori.
Clitori, perhaps?
Mm-hmm.
Clitorises.
Right. So those of you who own clitori, right, this is especially for you.
Right. And we have the pleasure of an interview with a wonderful guest who came up with one of the greatest words ever in the English language. We'll be talking with Dr. Laurie Mintz, who wrote the book called Becoming Clitorate, Why Orgasm Equality Matters and How to Get It.
Indeed. And it is such a great word. It really is.
Clitoracy.
And exactly, we do need some kind of social movement to improve our clitoracy.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, that's for men and women and everybody as well.
Yeah. With all of the just goofball, squirrely, crazy behavior people have with sexuality, nothing's been so just mysterious and never talked about and feared. People act like clitoris is a bad word.
Exactly.
We've seen parents react if a child knows that she has a clitoris. People are like, how do you know that? Who's touching you? Like, really?
Right,
You're
exactly.
going to jump to abuse because the kid knows what who taught you that?
That and unfortunately, that's way too common.
Yeah.
It really is. And and here's a just a beautiful irony that this word, this organ, this concept that is so shrouded in unknowns and mystery for most people, yet we would be hard-pressed to find anything that truly speaks to the core of what sex and sexuality is really about than the clitoris.
Pleasure.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's why we're so squirrely.
Right.
Because we're pleasure phobic.
That's right. That's right. And, it's easy to talk clinically. It's easy to talk about functions and body parts. The anatomy and the physiology stuff is real easy. But when it comes down to the pleasure, the eroticism, truly the nature of sexual behavior, right? I know we've posed this question before too, and would ask you to ask yourself this question. When you think about all of the different types of sexual activity you've had, intercourse and non-intercourse, ask yourself how many of those have had anything to do with reproduction.
Right.
Right? And I will also venture to presume that for many people who are listening and watching, the answer would be none.
Probably
Right?
for most
Absolutely
people.
none for
Right.
most people. Right. Right. So that we have such a separation between what is really a natural function and those parts of the body that bring us to those natural functions, and why all of us don't look at the clitoris as nothing but a gift is really kind of another mystery.
Yeah. As we talked about with Dr. Mintz, Freud talked about penis envy and couldn't have been more off base.
Oh,
It's
that's
got
right.
the wrong organ to be envious of.
Exactly. You know, guys can't be really subtle when they're playing with their penises, but you can be real subtle playing with your clitoris.
Yes.
Right? In fact, I could be doing it right now and nobody would know.
So yeah, we should get into it. Dr. Mintz is up in Gainesville, Florida. As we say down here in South Florida, if you want to go south, you got to drive north.
That's right.
Not in addition to the wonderful Becoming Clitorate book, Laurie also authored A Tired Woman's Guide to Passionate Sex, and dozens and dozens of articles and book chapters. She's a true scholar,
Yeah.
an academician, and we're just real happy to share our interview with you.
Indeed.
Welcome back. We are here with our wonderful guests today. Laurie Mintz, author of truly, no hyperbole, one of the most important sex therapy books in the past decade, Becoming Clitorate. Wonderful word. Why orgasm equality matters and how to get it. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Really, really, really. And we love your clitoris jewelry.
Thank you.
Joking earlier, Larry lost his.
That's right.
But this comes up often, but never more apropos than today. But at an ASEC conference in Denver a couple years ago, Larry won a beautiful 3D printed clitoris, about 10 inches tall, right?
Big
Purple, gorgeous.
Awesome.
And of course, it was a wonderful conversation starter at the bar. But I got to say, it was a little disappointing that no one outside of conference attendees, no women, no men, no bartenders, no one knew what it was. One woman thought it was a robe hanger. She held it upside down.
Are those antlers? There's another one of those.
I mean, it's sad, but it's also wonderful when you see the look on people's faces when they say that's especially women, right? So as two dudes who've been working in sex ed for 30 plus years, I always feel like I shouldn't know more about this than you if you have one and I don't. And I always said Freud got it wrong. If there was ever anything to be envious of, it certainly ain't penises.
Oh yeah.
I'm afraid if I had a clitoris, I wouldn't leave the house very often. So please tell us how this book came to be.
Well, thank you so much for your kind words describing the book. The book came to be due to my students, their stories, their frustration, their successes. So I teach the psychology of human sexuality at the University of Florida to about 150 students a year. And when I was teaching one year about the orgasm gap, or the consistent finding that when cisgender men and cisgender women get it on, the men are having way more orgasms than the women are, it really came to life to me with painful stories from my students about living the orgasm gap. And not just the female students, the male students too. Everybody was concerned about this. So I started teaching to close the gap about the clitoris, about all those things that would empower women to orgasm. And I started getting notes, beautiful notes. Thanks to your class, I'm orgasmic for the first time. Thanks to your class, my girlfriend's orgasmic. And I thought, I want to move this information outside of my classroom, outside of the University of Florida more broadly, because it seemed to me that a whole bunch of knowledge about the clitoris had been lost to a whole generation of women, and I wanted to bring it back to the forefront. So that's how I came to write the book.
Nice. And I want to point something out just in terms, because I think a lot of people don't even know sort of where that word even came from. And I just like it as one of the greatest ironies that we have, that when we look at the, let's say, lack of clitoracy that there is, when you see how sort of unknown and almost mysterious the clitoris is, how important it is on top of that. Doesn't the word clitoris actually kind of derive from the word key?
Yeah,
That it is like,
it does. It derives from the Greek word key. Exactly.
and I
Like
find
the
that
key
so
to the lock.
ironic.
It's the
Well,
key to women's pleasure.
yes,
Mm.
exactly. That's the thing. It is the key to so much of women's pleasure and sexuality, yet why is it such a mystery?
Well, I have a theory about why it's such a mystery. And that is, and I want to say loud and clear, I am not blaming men with this statement. I've been married to a man for 30 some years. I have a lot of men I love in my life. So this is not to blame men, it's to blame culture.
Mm-hmm.
It is, and I think men hurt from this as much as women do. It's the cultural privileging of male sexuality. And by that, I mean, when we privilege something, we assume that it's the right way, the default way, and everything else is like, should be measured against it. And men come very reliably from penis and vagina intercourse. And so we assume that women should come from penis and vagina intercourse. And we don't. Only about 15%. Maybe less, depends how you answer the question, maybe more, but ask the question, or we need clitoral stimulation. And so I think in the clitoris, and then, we could get into other issues, but basically I think it's, that women's sexuality has been compared to men's instead of given, its own attention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And and I can't to add on to that, I can't help but go back into some of the early roots of these things when we look at how this stuff even got named. When we look at the clitoris is part of the vulva, those external genital structures, and before we called it vulva, right, the original term for these structures was pudendum, which
Yes.
literally translates into something to be ashamed of. And
Absolutely.
I think when you talk about that privilege, I think people need to really understand what kind of historical legacy that privilege really represents.
Yes, and it goes so back. The clitoris has been lost and found and lost and found, but very shamed. And, a lot of people know the damage that Freud did
Yeah.
when he said that if you're a mature woman, what he said is you'll transfer your erotic feelings from your clitoris to your vagina. It's so ridiculous. That's like saying when you grow up, you'll stop breathing through your nose and you'll start breathing through your ears. Like, we don't just transfer our bodily functions from one place to another. And so it is a really, and even the language we use, that's actually my favorite chapter in my book, because I love this linguistic analysis, but this really demonstrates the privileging to me. The fact that we call our entire genitals a vagina.
Mm-hmm.
So by like the vagina is the hole that, the canal, penises go in, babies come out. The vulva, as you said, is the external portion, but we call our whole genitals a vulva. And by doing so, we're calling our genitals by the part that gives men the most pleasure, not the part that gives us the most pleasure. And we use the word sex and intercourse as if they're one and the same, even though half the population doesn't come from sex. And we call foreplay as like what comes before. It's just a lead up to the main event, when it's really the main event for a lot of us.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that last point, I'll tell you, that kind of irks me a little bit when I hear so many sexologists describing it in that way as well. I think, again, that's how deeply seated that gets.
Well, and as he said, the cultural context, the number of women who refer to all of it as my down there, as if that's a thing.
Yeah.
And the guy's script, of course, get it up, get it in, move it back and forth until the magic happens, then get it out and get a snack, right? and the cluelessness is just so aggravating that even, as you said, that percentage of women that do, that small percentage of women that can orgasm from intercourse, it's still the inside parts of the clitoris that are being stimulated. The vagina itself is not so sensate. And it's just, I think, one of the most frustrating of the sexual myths that we're always busting about what provides pleasure.
Yeah, and I think, and as Larry said, we're always busting it, and it's so deeply ingrained. I've heard other sex therapists, sex educators not know this, ignore it, or when their clients come to them saying, I want to learn to orgasm during intercourse, they help them try instead of just saying, you don't need to do that.
Mhm.
How do you do it when you're by yourself? Get that same stimulation with a partner.
Right.
So yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But that's such a reframing for so many women to not be partner oriented, especially with their orgasms, and to be self-focused, self-centered, because that's where pleasure does come from. It's an inside out phenomenon.
Mm.
Yes, absolutely. The best sex is when both people can be mindfully tuned into their own experience, which is why lesbian sex is more orgasmic, because it's turn taking.
Right.
And they each get their turn and to totally immerse in their pleasure. But with heterosexual sex, we expect to enjoy the same things and at the same magical time. It's like, that's not very mindful sex. First of all, most women can't orgasm that way. And secondly, is he going to come yet? Oh, I got to time mine. Oh, okay. Hang on a second. That's not going to get you an orgasm
No.
because you're too up here.
That's right.
Yeah.
Sex therapists, it took me a while to really find that comfort and understanding. I guess it's about a dozen or 15 years since mindfulness has kind of seeped into sex therapy. But, I was trained with this idea of spectatoring, that standing at the edge of the bed going, up, don't you come, and up, you better not lose that erection. And that that's a very, very different kind of self-observation. And that's
Yes.
where the anxiety comes in, and the, people aren't even noticing their partner's pleasure, which would get them off or keep them erect or help them orgasm or.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
And even what you said, like standing at the end of the bed going, keep that erection, probably the message, I'm guessing, is keep it for her,
Right.
because she needs you to last long and thrust hard.
Right.
And she doesn't. And if you can let go of that, you can immerse in your own pleasure and not have that same pressure. You can take turns.
Right.
And one thing I always feel the need to qualify when, again, we, talking about that idea of spectatoring and focusing on what you're doing is, to me, that difference is the spectatoring versus the sort of self-observation is just the element of being judgmental and critical in the spectatoring. Because I think that's really where that disconnection is, because, you're sort of stepping out and there's a lot of this, you better not, you're not supposed to. And it really is that kind of performance grading that ends up, I think, being that negative. But if it can be more positive, again, am I doing it? Is this something that I'm enjoying? Is my partner enjoying this? I mean, this can be that self-focus, that self-observation can really add to the quality of what's happening.
Yes. Yeah. I love that. I think that is such a very subtle but important point. It's not that you're not noticing yourself. You're not judging yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you. Yeah. That's so good.
So
I want to ask you, Laurie, if you could also talk more about the idea of orgasm equality from a different angle, because I think a lot of folks, even I bust myself in how I recommend your book, which I have many, many times, but usually more to women. And I think this is a really important concept for men as well, not just for men who love women, but orgasm equality kind of goes both ways with this sexist double standard that people kind of accept that a woman might not have an orgasm every time she has sex, but for men, or intercourse or whatever activity, for men there seems to be this 100% or catastrophe. Like one time a guy doesn't come, it's like, what's the matter? You're not into me. What's going on? And right, could you address that?
Yeah, and that's part of the so deeply ingrained sexism, that even, even feminists, even sex therapists like that I've talked to, they have to fight that because it's so deeply ingrained. And I have two examples, I think, that drive it home. Is I have in Becoming Clitoris, I have a thought experiment I ask people to engage in. Like, imagine a sexual encounter and your partner doesn't come. How do you feel? And it's like, terrible, bad, something's wrong with me. Okay, you don't come. How do you feel? Okay. And so I think that really drives it home. And the other thing is, another chapter, Becoming Clitoris, I talk about changing the script from, foreplay, intercourse, male ejaculation, sex over, to these different turn-taking models. You come first, you come second. And I have one in there where I say, only you come. And I talk about someone who wrote into my Psych Today blog who said, every Sunday morning, I just stimulate my wife's clitoris. She has a great orgasm. It's a giving and loving experience. And it's just the best part of the week. And every time I tell that story, people are like, that's weird. And I'm like, really? Is it weird that that's happening in reverse all the time?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, I hadn't really considered that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And again, that weirdness, right? That whole aspect and that whole characterization, for me, that kind of comes from the discomfort of the unfamiliar, right? And it's just, and to me, that's just how I define comfort anyway, as being familiar. It often feels good, but that's not necessarily what comfort is. It's more about the familiarity. So when we look at this pattern that you're describing, that is so familiar to everybody, and breaking out of that pattern may seem weird. Right? But with that being said, I know, we all have seen and spoken to women who are not only ignorant, I'll use that word, not knowing about their clitoris, but what about all of these women that are ashamed or afraid of their clitoris?
Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of ignorance, but there's also a lot of shame. And I think the shame is less about the clitoris that I've seen and more about, this is the way I come. Is there like that I need to touch it to come? I can't come through intercourse. I need external stimulation. Like, there's so much shame around that. And that's what I see a lot. Like, I'm not normal.
Right.
Yeah. And also shame around the way their vulvas look. Oh my gosh, so much terrible body image. And you certainly can't enjoy, certain types of sex, like oral sex, if you don't like the way your vulva looks. And a lot of that is that, porn, and I'm not anti-porn, it's just not a role model. It's not education.
Right.
They show men are chosen for having really big penises, bigger than average, and women are often chosen or have surgery for having even and petite inner lips. And the inner lips, I actually have a vulva puppet here. So
Yay! Yay!
Yeah. So the inner lips, are not even and petite. Often one is bigger than the other, and it sticks out from the external lips. And, I actually tell my students, just to get the shame gone, I'm like, hey, my vulva looks like a tongue with a face with a tongue sticking out. And I'm like, it's perfectly normal.
Right.
It's what gives vulvas their personality. But so many are ashamed and they think they're ugly and dirty and they don't look like what they've seen in the movies, kind of thing.
Yeah, and again, it's in the last several years, just the increase in women going for these sort of labial and vaginal reconstructive procedures.
Design a vagina.
Yeah. I mean, I really think that speaks to a level of shame.
It does.
That it's not, and in some ways, it seems to parallel, but go way beyond how men tend to define themselves by their penises. That it seems like women are defining their worth, their sense of being, by maybe the shape of their vulvas. Is that something that you see as well?
I think that, yeah, there's just so much shame, the way they look, the way they smell. That's the other piece, right? Like, I got to get some douche or deodorant to cover the smell. Like, there's just so much shame around how it looks, how it smells, and needing to touch it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, as we've said, this really has a long historical legacy. So here we are coming on to 2021. How do we break this? I know we've been doing the work that we've all been doing for so long, and we're still having these conversations.
Yeah. And, I think it's so interesting because, when I wrote Becoming Clitorate, I had two distinct reactions depending on people's age. People who were sort of my age or 60s kind of thing, or around there, who grew up in the sexual revolution were like, doesn't everybody know that? Are you kidding me? And the younger people were saying, this is radical. This is revolutionary. And I mean, that's that thing about the clitoris being lost and found. And my sincere hope is that we find it and we don't ever lose it again. But I mean, I think we are fighting a weight of the culture, but I do think the time is now. Mm-hmm. I really do. I think for a lot of reasons, women's empowerment is coming back for very sad reasons in many ways, but it's a good thing. And I think that sexual empowerment is part of that.
Right. And, I just want to underscore that appearing and disappearing thing is almost literal. I recall hearing Helen O'Connell, the Australian urogynecologist, talking about how her surgical anatomy text, the textbook in which she learned to be a urogynecological surgeon, had like a page and a half on the mechanism and function of the penis and barely a line or two about the clitoris, and how Grey's Anatomy for a time literally had removed any reference at all to the clitoris.
Exactly.
For I don't remember how many years. It's like even physicians, and how many centuries have we been dissecting, and have physicians been learning about the function of every part of our bodies except our sexual parts in our lifetime, in the 60s, since Masters and Johnson's work. How did that slip under the radar for centuries?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer. Right?
Yeah. and I think, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Please. No, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think there is that sort of the duality of those sexual parts, that if there's reproductive function, we'll acknowledge it. If the only function related to it is pleasure, no, we don't even acknowledge the reality of that.
Exactly. And the clitoris is, as you both well know, but I'll say it in case someone listening doesn't know, the clitoris is the only organ in the entire human body, male or female, whose sole purpose is pleasure.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, that's a pretty powerful organ.
It really is. It's something I do enjoy pointing out to religious people who are very sex negative.
Right.
Right.
If you ever need a reason to embrace it. I mean, again, if you have a problem with that, you got to take it up with the manufacturer.
Yeah. In fact, I had a very religious client who was not having orgasms. She was also not having clitoral stimulation. So I told her all about the clitoris, as I do, and educated her. And she came back the next week. And I don't know if she found a book that she read this in or came up with it on her own. But she came back and she said, you know what? I believe the clitoris is God's gift to me, and I am going to take full advantage of it.
Wonderful.
That's what we want to hear.
Yeah. So nice to hear.
Yeah, it really is. So, and again, on that, part of educating and teaching women, because I know we and I have talked about things with women over the years, but we are not clitoris owners. So I think there's always got to be something sort of missing in the translation. And I am truly amazed, as Ricky had sort of said before, that, you know, why do we know more about the clitoris than so many women, that I find so many women have no idea how the clitoris functions, what it does, that it is an active, not a static organ. There is movement in the clitoris. There's growth in the clitoris. So can you maybe just give a sort of a little just sort of clitoral overview of what the clitoris is doing through, you know, sexual response and function?
Absolutely. So as we've said, the clitoris is a vast internal organ with external parts. The only two external parts are the hood, which is analogous to the male foreskin if it's not removed, and the glans, which is, you know, about the size of a pencil eraser and too sensitive to touch often. And then the internal one, it's like it fits like that. The legs go around it, around the vaginal canal, up through this mons pubis. And the clitoris is getting an erection. That's what it's doing.
Mm-hmm.
So just like a penis, and you know, in fetuses there are you know, analogous, but you know, when you get aroused, you have these special capillaries, right? You all know this. Blood flows in and it doesn't flow out until you have rhythmic contractions that release the blood. And that's what a very brief rudimentary what's an erection. But it's the same for clitorises.
Yeah.
Our inner lips they get much bigger. They get engorged with blood. They change. And then at the point of orgasm, the blood is released.
People are especially undergrads, are always surprised to see when I showed side-by-side cross-section of a penis and a clitoris, except for the urethra, which runs through the length of a penis, they look exactly the same.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, they both derive from the same embryological tissue. So even from the very basics, Sex Ed 101 for virtually everyone, right? Boys have a penis and girls have a vagina. Really would be, I always say it's not wrong, but it's not exactly accurate. We really should say boys have a penis and girls have a clitoris, but that little kid in kindergarten blurts that out. Somehow we don't think it's so cute.
Right, and even sex ed, it's so different. I was just talking to students, you know, they still often separate the genders, which, you know, is really unfair to people who are gender nonconforming, but that's a whole nother topic.
Right.
And what I understand is that the boys still get stuff about ejaculation, which is sexual. The girls get told about their period.
Right, absolutely. No mention.
No mention. No mention.
It's the same thing. It's like behind the boys have a penis, girls have a vagina. Is boys stuff is on the outside and girls stuff is all shush shush. It's all up inside. You don't look, you don't touch. You have no business down there. Right. Instead of recognizing we all have our sexual parts on the outside.
Yeah, and exactly. And there was a study when you were saying, Larry, about how men know more about the clitoris. I remember reading a study. They asked college men these questions, and these college women. The men knew more about it than the women. Wow. And maybe it's because if they're heterosexual, maybe they're at least they're down there, you know, having some fun. And you know, and you all, you know, you have to touch your penis to pee. We don't have to look. We don't have to touch. We don't have to get to know ourselves. It takes concerted effort to do so.
And a mirror.
Right.
And a mirror. Yeah.
Right.
Or a selfie stick.
Yes. Well,
you know, again, looking at this comparison between penis and clitoris, and tell me if this is true or not. It seems maybe one difference between the functioning of the penis and the clitoris is rather than just remaining sort of erect until the blood leaves, is there really something, I kind of refer to it as a retraction reaction, that for a lot of women right before orgasm, it seems like the clitoris sort of pulls back.
Yes, and that I didn't mention that, and I apologize because I think you were mentioning that about the movement. So yeah, right before the point of orgasm, the clitoris does it's confusing for a lot of people who are touching it. Where'd it go?
And why'd you stop?
It went away.
I lost the clitoris.
Yeah, see? Everybody loses their clitoris, right? But it's just one of the changes that happened. The other thing that, as long as we're talking about changes that happen, and you all know this, but I tell women this all the time, that just because, and men, just because someone is wet or aroused doesn't mean it's time to have intercourse, because the vagina goes through two really important changes during arousal. It gets lubricated, and not everybody produces enough of their own lubrication. No shame in store-bought lubrication, but the cervix also pulls up and out of the way. The vagina becomes what I call a wet tent, right? It gets more narrow in the around the vaginal opening, and then it tents up. And if you have penetrative sex before those two changes, it's going to hurt, because the penis is going to hit the cervix. And that's the other thing I tell my students, and they're like, oh, I'm blown away. That's why it hurts. Like, because it's like, there's so little attention to arousing the woman with her clitoris that is just all so intercourse focused. It's not only causing women not to orgasm, it's resulting in a lot of sexual pain.
Yeah. I tell a lot of heterosexual guys in the couples I work with to not only not be in such a rush to enter, but try and use their penis, or have their partner use their penis like a toy, and stimulate the vulva and the clitoris, and really even, so-called intromission between the labia rather than right into the vagina.
Absolutely.
And it also enhance the arousal so that she would be more receptive if intercourse is going to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm so glad that you said that, Laurie, because it's, that's, again, one of those just sort of, these quick and easy ways of defining things. Like, a guy just needs to be hard and a woman just needs to be wet. Right? And that's it. If you have that, you're good to go.
And you're not, as we know.
Right. So I'm glad you pointed that out, because people have to realize that this is a time factor. Even after wetness, and there are some women that can get very wet very quickly, but they're nowhere near ready. Exactly. And there are some women where you'll get that tenting, you'll get that movement, and they might not be very wet. So this is really, I think, kind of, it's a process. We have to take our time, and we have to, really going back to that sort of inward focus to see where we are in those moments.
Absolutely. And being attuned to your own body and not ashamed, because there's the other piece. Like, so much shame. I'm too wet. I'm not wet enough. Like, so much shame.
Oh, we'll have to have a whole other show about squirting.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But speaking of time factors, I always hate this feeling that I wish we can just talk all night, but we have to wrap. But I do also want to share that we are so fortunate and so looking forward at Modern Sex Therapy Institutes that Dr. Mintz is going to be doing a lecture for us coming up next weekend. No, the 14th. For any therapists listening, you may be interested in Laurie's presentation on treating the two most common sexual complaints among women: orgasm issues and diminished desire.
I'm really honored to be presenting that workshop, and I've been really honored I'm big fans of your work, and I'm really honored that you had me on the show. So thank you.
It's a mutual admiration society, because we're just tickled.
Indeed. And I do hope we can both continue this conversation and have some of these other important conversations with you as we continue to move forward.
I would love that.
So
thank you.
Again, Dr. Laurie Mintz, headquartered in Gainesville. We're going to put up the book and your contact information. And again, we hope this is just the first of more conversations.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's just another one of those things. I think we're so lucky to be able to know the people we know and have these people willing to talk to us.
Right. It's great. I mean, hopefully we'll be able to get back to conferences again, which honestly, the longer we're in the field, the more they just become family reunions. I miss them terribly.
Absolutely.
And yeah, Laurie's that kind of family.
Really. And again, so appreciate the time and the information.
And the book you have written. It's
Yeah.
just immediately risen to that top shelf of books that sex therapists recommend to their patients. You know, I think of Ian Kerner, She Comes First. Emily Nagoski's Come As You
Come
Are.
As You Are.
Paul Joanniti's Guide to Getting It On. Right? These and this Becoming Clitoris has really taken its place on that shelf.
It really has.
So one more toast
Yes,
to
indeed.
Dr. Laurie Mintz and everyone becoming more clitorate.
Absolutely. And please, use your cliteracy to understand yourself, to talk to each other, and above all, be a clitorate voter.
Yes,
All right.
well said. And this is not a book for women only. Men should read this book. Men, above all, should be the most clitorate.
Exactly. Thanks for watching.
Join us next week and every week, Fridays at 7 East Coast time for Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers.
Stay well.
Thanks for watching Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers. Join us each week on Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern. You can also follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay on top of the latest developments in the ever-changing world of sex and sexuality.